What's up, summoners? King Blair here. In Epic 7, there's a wide variety of playstyles that you can use in PvP in order to succeed. Whether that's bruiser teams, tank teams, aggro teams, or even cleave teams, you have a wide selection of what you can use. But there's one playstyle that used to be extremely dominant in the meta that today is a remnant of its past self and barely sees any play, almost not even being viable anymore. And that playstyle is going to be none other than Control. So what we're going to be talking about today is the Control playstyle. What is it? What happened to it? Why is it so much weaker now than it was before? And then, can it ever come back in the game? Is there a way that it will be coming back? So if you like the video, make sure you like, subscribe, and join the Discord server, link down in the description. Without further ado, let's get right into it. So first, how will the video play out so you can have an idea of what the discussion that we're going to be following. First, we will talk about Control as a playstyle. What was it? What is it? And what can it do, right? Then we'll talk about what happened to it and what inherent weaknesses does it have that make it not as viable anymore. And then at the very end, we will talk about whether or not it can ever really become viable again in the game. What would need to happen for it to even have a shot at ever becoming a real playstyle. Now, this does not mean that control units are bad, right? There are still some very strong control units such as Cerise, and even Fairy Tale Tenebria as a last pick still remains a very strong and oppressive pick. But for the most part, Control as a playstyle is all but dead. So with that, let's start the discussion. So first, what is Control, right? What's control teams? So before, if you never fought against a control team, usually it was a team that consisted of 2 to 3 debuffers, or 2 debuffers, 1 stripper, 1 DPS, and 1 flex pick, right? And the whole goal of this control team is to apply so many debuffs on you, stun you, slow you, decrease your attack, and slow you down to the point that the DPSs would be able to finish off your team over time, right? And sometimes it used to be very fast, sometimes it was very slow. And it used to be one of the best counters, believe it or not, to tank teams, because tank teams did not have the speed to keep up with how often you could cycle your control skill. When we think about control in the past, we think of units such as Fairy Tale Tenebria, Sage Ball, a Tywin, and even units like Roman, who used to be one of the times when Control was doing pretty good and it was actually pretty balanced and it was just really, really annoying. But one thing that Control has always had is that it's always been annoying, and people have always hated it because you inherently can't play the game, right? And there's always a memes that, hey, if you're playing against Control, you're going to be able to get your PHC because you won't be able to move. So that was the Control playstyle, and those were some of the units, you know, like Broman, a Tywin, Silver Bear Minthia, Sage Ball, we just mentioned them. And they were all pretty good, and everything was nice and balanced. Even Control at some point in Season 3 saw a huge success with units like Sage Ball and Ambitious Tywin, who are honestly extremely powerful and Control units on their own right? A Tywin was incredibly powerful and used to be an almost must-have for Legend. That's the extent of how powerful Control was. Well, now we're going to get to the second part of the video. What happened to Control? How did it go from being this super viable strategy that could counter tank teams to being something that it's no longer that strong? Well, first, we have to talk about the inherent disadvantage of Control. One of the inherent disadvantages of Control is going to be 15% FRES. No matter how high your effectiveness is, you have a 15% chance of missing your debuff. So when we think of a unit like a Tywin, even if he has all this effectiveness, he always will inherently have a 15% chance to miss, right? That inherently is a disadvantage that Control has always had, and is one of the reasons Control units are usually so overtuned, is to be able to make up for the RNG, where if it's good RNG, you stop the opponent, but if it's bad RNG, you lose the game, right? And you can think of things like units like Broman, right? Where Broman is not really that consistent, and you know, but if it lands, you basically can win off of that skill, right? But because of that usually that effectiveness stat is also a detriment, because it also means that you're sacrificing other stats such as speed in order to achieve those high effectiveness. So those are the inherent weaknesses that Control always had, and it's one of the reasons it was never the strongest playstyle. Well, everything changed with Fairy Tale freaking Tenebria, and as an oldie Control player, I hate this unit. When I talk about Control, she's the unit that pushed Control from being a balanced, annoying playstyle to going the next level to toxic, right? She's the one that was the cornerstone of control Cleave. She was the cornerstone of Bruiser control. She was just the unit that pushed control over the edge and made it so all these harsh things came down upon it. And no control unit to this day has even come close to what Fairy Tail Tenebria was and continues to be. With Fairy Tail Tenebria, we got a control unit that bypasses some of the weaknesses that other control units have. Very few units have 100% chance to land their critical debuffs, right? When we think of units that can do that are things like Moonlight Aramantia and the units like Dizzy, right? That have really powerful S3s that can land and are consistent, but they all had one weakness. And that weakness was that you could not strip buffs, making immunity always pretty good against them and making you have to bring a stripper. Well, Fairy Tail Tenebria throws that all out the window with the ability for herself to be able to strip and apply some extremely nasty debuffs like Redirect Provoke that essentially takes away that turn 1 advantage, as well as cannot be buffed, so it makes it extremely hard for the opponent to even come back. On top of all that, if the unit attacks and was provoked, you can even land even more debuffs on the opponent, making it even that much harder for the opponent to act and be able to play the game. And this is all one unit and one control unit. No other control unit came even close. Usually they sacrifice something. When you talk about consistency, you think like Bassar. He's able to soul burn and ignore FRES, but Bassar doesn't really apply that many more debuffs, right? No, Fairy Tail Tenebria doesn't care. On top of that, low cooldown S3, right? When you think of hard CC, you think of units like Moonlight Aramantia, right? That are able to stun and do a ton of work, right? And put a lot of debuffs. Well, she can't strip, but you know who can? Fairy Tail Tenebria. So with the release of Fairy Tail Tenebria, control counters needed to happen because of how strong she was. Before it was just, okay, you can just build some FRES units, you can put some immunity setters, and you're chilling, right? You're chilling. But Fairy Tail Tenebria did not have the mistake, as well as an incredible stat line where she could have very high effectiveness if you imprinted her, as well as having really good starting speed. And she didn't have to be tanky, as tanky, because if you outsped, you took turn 1 priority. Well, with that, and with how strong she was, she essentially power crept every control unit in the game and will continue to in the future. Think of someone like Ida. Her kit is actually really good. If Fairy Tail Tenebria didn't exist and all of Fairy Tail Tenebria's counters didn't exist, Ida would actually be a really good unit and will be really unique to the game because she's able to kind of fit into a control Cleave. She's able to stun, she's able to strip and push back a little bit and push you up, right? Be able to be a little bit more aggressive. But why ever use her when Fairy Tail Tenebria exists? And that's honestly the reason why control got all the counters that it did and started the spiral downward. Then we started getting the control counters, such as Designer Lilibet, that are able to just completely shut out Fairy Tail Tenebria and a majority of control teams of its type, because she essentially is just immune to debuffs. We saw a resurgence in people building their high FRES units. When we think of units that with high FRES, we think of things like Kitty Clarissa, right? Kitty Clarissa, people were started building Kitty Clarissas at 300 FRES. And normally, that wouldn't be that much of a problem, but the thing that started creating is because people started putting more FRES on their units and making it so their units were reaching almost 300 FRES, other control units needed to put a ton of effectiveness to be able to do a job that Fairy Tail Tenebria was already doing better than them, and because of that, they lost a lot of speed stat, leaving them extremely susceptible to Cleave teams. So one of the predators of control teams is actually Cleave, because as we mentioned, you have to sacrifice speed for effectiveness, but with so many FRES units being around and you needing to increase your effectiveness, the speed started going down and units like Assassin Sid started preying on control teams, because no matter how good your control unit is and how high the effectiveness is, you're always going to get outsped by an A Sid or another speed contester, right? So that was a lot of the things that started spiraling control out of the meta and making it so they honestly rarely saw any form of play. But then there is more. We have the new unit releases, right? We have a unit like Carrot, and Carrot is unique because she's able to self-cleanse every single turn and is hard to kill, and control typically always struggle to kill, but you have a unit that just self-cleanses, right? She just says no, and just cleanses every other turn 1 debuff, making it very hard to lock down, and she's able to pump out insane amount of damage without ever really having to attack as well, meaning that control teams can't kill her properly, meaning they can't function as well against her. And we also had buffed Violet with the evasion. How are you ever going to be able to hit him with a control unit? If he evades, you're not doing anything, right? So again, all these things are not looking too good for control. And then last but definitely not least is the resurgence of Soul Weavers with the Maid Chloe buff. That was honestly the nail in the coffin. She inherently has high FRS because of her passive as well as her self imprint, that it makes it so unless you have a dedicated debuffer, you're not even going to touch her, and she's going to be able to cleanse the whole team with attack buff and one tap your squishy control team, right? So all these things, and then even things like Elena, right? And then if you're trying to get the effectiveness to actually be able to hit her, then you're going to be met with a speed contester and lose because you sacrifice speed in order for effectiveness. So with all these things, control has dropped significantly. But can control ever come back, right? Can they ever make it to be back? When we think about a Tywin, Fairy Tail Tenebria, all these units rarely see play. I cannot think of the, I see Fairy Tail Tenebria 1 every 10 games, if at all, right? And she is broken, right? She is toxic, but you rarely see her because there's already so many counters in the game to her. Same thing with a Tywin. When was the last time you faced an a Tywin that actually was there and controlled you and did his job properly? There wasn't. And a Tywin is a broken unit inherently. Stuns, slows, cleansing, provokes, soul stealing, right? He is stacked. And even he is not enough to crack into the current meta because of how aggressive the current meta is and because of how many counters there inherently are to control. So can it ever come back? Well, the answer is it's unlikely. Control as a playstyle is all but dead at this point, because even with these broken units, it's not enough. The only way that control can ever come back into the game is if we see some crazy tanky units that completely shut out Cleave, that you're able to easily control, and we have control units that are just so overpowered that they make Fairy Tail Tenebria look like a garbage unit. And that's the only way control will ever be able to come back at full force. And we're talking broken, think about this. This is culmination. This is peak control, and it is not enough. The only other thing that could be stronger than this is unable to be buffed debuffs. And honestly, if the game ever gets to that point, we're in for a doozy. And even then, it's highly unlikely because you still got things like Rem that can just become immune to any type of CC, right? So at the end of the day, control as a playstyle will likely never be coming back. Long are the days gone where you could put a million debuffs on your opponent and watch as they crumble to the pressure. At this point, to all my control players, I'm sorry, and I hope to see you in a different season. But with that, can you still play control units? Yes, as we mentioned, Cerise is still strong. Cerise can still function, but more as a support for your team and as a last pick like Fairy Tail Tenebria, rather than as a playstyle. But that is all I got for you guys today, and I will see you next time. Peace.